This isn't, I can't see myself. I generally don't plan what I'm going to talk about when I give lectures. And it's not because I'm disrespectful of the audience. I appreciate that people take their time to listen to what I have to say and find interest in me sharing my ideas. But I speak 5 or 6 days a week on average, and sometimes 8 or 10 times in a week. And so I'm just, I pretty much lecture every day on average. On a slow week, I'll lecture 5 times, and on a busy week, I'll lecture 8 or 10. So you could say on average, I lecture every day. And then, of course, I counsel people. That's a huge part of what I do also, and that happens on a daily basis as well. Today is my 22nd wedding anniversary. And so today at some point I started getting annoyed because even though everybody knows it's my wedding anniversary because I put it up on Instagram, and so the whole world must know. Somehow or other, everybody feigned like they didn't know and called me almost more often than usual to prattle on about their, micro issues in life, seemingly ad nauseum. At a certain point, I was like, it's my wedding anniversary. Of course, then everybody scurried like a bunch of cockroaches when the light got turned on. Oh, of course, no problem. But they knew before they called me and texted me that this was the case, but somehow or other I had to say something. Once I said something, then everybody, like I said, it was like a scattering. So you might think I'd be tempted to talk about marriage and fidelity and commitment. But that wasn't what's on my mind today. I'm still thinking about George Floyd and BLM and the protests and riots, which have largely died down, like they always do. It's okay. Because that's just what's on my mind, because it's what's been going on. That's what I'm talking to people about all day long. So that's what's in my head. So I generally don't prepare lectures because I'm always thinking about something or reading about something or studying something or talking to people about something, and usually I find that stuff which is most personal ends up also being most universal. I usually find what's most personal ends up being most universal. So anyway, I'll see if I get around to talking about my anniversary and the sacred institution of marriage and commitment and those things. But I'm just going to start where I start. I watched Dave Chappelle last night on Instagram because that's what I do. Well, I'm not lecturing to you guys. And it was the first, I think it was one of the first comedy shows, outdoors. He was there. He's really got to stop smoking. But I don't think he rehearsed. I think he had some material, some jokes, but he just didn't get around to them. It wasn't funny. He didn't cut any jokes. People weren't laughing. And he talked about George Floyd and went into real specifics and how it affected him, and because that's just what's on everybody's mind. All right, so we're going to run with that a little bit. Do you guys all know how George Floyd died? I doubt it. So I'm going to just assume ignorance on your part, even though you all think you do. I'm going to assume ignorance on your part, and I'm just going to go over it in some detail. Varangi, stop taking over the feed. Mute yourself. Thank you. George Floyd is my age. He's 46 years old. Tall guy, big guy, 6'5", 6'6", big guy. And he was at a liquor store, convenience store in Minneapolis. I think it was called Cup Convenience Store. And it seems like he passed off a fake 20 and bought some cigarettes. And then went and sat out in a car just across the street from the convenience store and did whatever he was doing. When I saw the police first arrest him, detain him, it seemed like he might have been arrested already, but he was at least being detained. There's 3 levels of detention by police officers. Do you guys know this? Police officers can start a conversation with you. And you can, if you talk to them, then you're there with them. But you ever see people say to the police officer, "Am I free to go?" It's because if they start a conversation with you, they can't detain you. If they pull you over, it's assumed you're being detained because you can't just drive away. There's some lack of legality of DUI stops. Because a DUI stop is a detention, but officers aren't allowed to detain you without probable cause. So a police officer can start a conversation with you, but you can just simply say to him, "Am I free to go? Am I free to go? Am I free to go?" Sometimes they won't answer you. because they don't want to tell you you're free to go. In which case you'll say, I'm going to leave now. And if I'm not free to go, please tell me that you're detaining me. And then you walk away. Then there's their detaining you. They have probable cause. They have to tell you what their probable cause is. If you don't have, you got probation, you forfeit some of your rights. I'm not exactly sure how it works with regards to the initial confrontation, but you don't have the Fourth Amendment rights to your personal property. You forfeit those so they can search you at will if you're on probation. It's your Fourth Amendment rights that you give up by being on probation. The condition of probation is that you lose your Fourth Amendment rights to your person and your property. So at a certain point they say, I have probable cause, you're detained, sit down. Then they arrest you, which is where they have to Miranda you and tell you that you have a right to remain silent before they try to get you to give incriminating evidence on yourself. Surprised how much I know about this stuff, Howard? Howard was in law enforcement for a number of years. And so these are 3 levels of being stopped by police officers. One is a casual conversation. They can ask you anything. They can also lie to you and say you have to let us in your house, even though you don't have to. And if you let them in, they're allowed to deceive you. They're under no obligation to tell you the truth. But if they detain you without probable cause, then there's this rule, which is the fruit of the poison tree. Anything they get from you, if they detained you unlawfully, can't be used against you. So they discover a dead body in your house and they searched it unlawfully, that can't be submitted as evidence and you walk away from murder. So it's very important that they follow the rules of engagement properly. I'm pretty sure that George Floyd had not been arrested. He was being detained, and when they detain you for their own safety, they are allowed to handcuff you or do other stuff with you. They're allowed to do that when they're detaining you for their own safety. Sometimes they'll say, for my safety, I'm going to place your hands behind your back and handcuff you while you're being detained, even though you haven't been arrested yet. So anyway, George Floyd sat down in the car. The cops came out to the car. Did I do all right there, Howard? I got everything right?
Yes.
Okay. So they came out to the car where he was sitting. And when they initially were talking with him, somehow the conversation didn't go well, and they pulled him out of the car. And he resisted arrest, which is an automatic arrest. That's done. So I don't know if they Miranda'd him yet. It didn't seem like enough time had gone on for them to have fully arrested him. But just the act of resisting arrest, if the cops are detaining you and telling you what to do, that act of resistance is itself grounds for being arrested. So there was a little struggle, and you just don't do that. He kind of mildly resisted, but you don't do that with the cops. You either commit to resisting arrest or you comply. But that kind of halfway in between, you're like, don't touch me, it doesn't work. And so I had the feeling that he must have been intoxicated. I thought maybe he was drinking or something like that. Turns out he wasn't drinking. He had some amounts of methamphetamine and fentanyl in his system, so he was under the influence of something recently. So anyway, they pulled him out of the car because they got this report of somebody, him passing off a fake 20. And those guys from the convenience store, they came out and they told him, give us our money back or give us our cigarettes back. Or take your money back, give us our cigarettes back. He wouldn't do it. Then they went and called the cops. Cops showed up. Obviously, he didn't think he'd done that much wrong because he was sitting outside in the car. The conversation didn't go well. The initial conversation turned into them detaining him. He resisted arrest, and he must have been arrested. They took him from point A to point B. Some other cops showed up. That includes Derek Chauvin and his cohorts, his accomplices. And then he didn't want to get in the cop car. He had some kind of, you can hear him, he had some kind of claustrophobia. He was trying to avoid getting put in the cop car. And he fought it. At some point, maybe they got him in or they dragged him out the other side. I can't remember how he got from one side of the car to the other. He might have gone in and the other cops showed up and he was making such a fuss, they pulled him out. And then they got on top of him to control him because he was kind of fighting. You can't really make it out from the videos, from the different angles they got, but all of a sudden the cops kind of jump on him, and usually that means the guy's fighting with them on some level, which probably just means resisting arrest. Then they got him prone, which means face down, and they all sat on him. And when you look at the normal footage of him being choked to death, him being strangled to death, a strangle is actually a better term. A choke is an obstruction to your airway. A strangle is when somebody constricts your breathing and kills you, renders you unconscious. So he was strangled to death. What you don't see usually from the normal angle they give, which is where you can hear him talking from the person's cell phone camera, across the street somebody else shows it, and they show 3 other cops laying on his body or sitting on his body. So there's actually 4 police officers on top of him. Did you guys know that? Okay, half of you didn't know that. There's 4 police officers off top of him at one time. Now, anybody below your waist, they're not doing anything to you. But when you start to get above your waist and people sit on top of you, it becomes really problematic. And I'll explain more about that in a bit. But anyway, George Floyd probably passed off a fake 20. Was sitting in his car. The guys came out and said, "Give us our cigarettes back." He wouldn't do it. He had some drugs in his system. And then the cops showed up. They pulled him out of the car. He resisted mildly. They cuffed him. They moved him from point A to point B. Other cops showed up. He was claustrophobic, didn't want to go in the car, which obviously is not going to go over well with law enforcement. Eventually that led to him getting put on the other side of the car, or maybe across the front of the car. It's hard to fully make it out from the angles that are available, and the criminal trial hasn't taken place yet. So eventually all these details will come out because the cops will all give each other up and it'll all come out. And then Derek Chauvin, who knew him, they bounced at the same club. Derek Chauvin and George Floyd bounced at the same club and had overlapping shifts, so they would have passed the baton. Did you know that? How crazy is that? Derek Chauvin did not look like a guy who should be bouncing. He must have gotten the job simply because of his badge. George Floyd was in really good shape, and he was a big guy, and so he made more sense to me as a bouncer. Anyway, they knew each other on some level. Derek Chauvin then got on his neck, put his knee on his neck. Those are the famous footage you see with his hands in his pocket, which was really disturbing to me. And I was surprised. It was really disturbing to Dave Chappelle also. He went on about that for some minutes, and I was like, I felt some kinship with him, because as soon as I saw the video, it was like one of the most disturbing things to me was the way he had his hands in his pocket, showing that he wasn't actually doing anything. He was like if you're trying to restrain somebody, your hands are not in your pockets. If you've got your hands in your pockets, you're actually not working. You're doing nothing. You follow? You have no balance at all with your hands in your pocket on your knees. So it meant that the person was not resisting at all. And he was totally contained. In which case, what's the reason for laying on him? Anyway, 4 cops, only one of which you can see were actually laying on him. They were up on him, on their knees, holding him down. It's a very standard practice, and it's what weak cops do when they have to overpower a bigger person. If it's larger cops, they generally don't have to resort to this. But you get it's like a dog pile type situation, which makes a lot of sense. The big guy's resisting arrest, then you dog pile them. Sometimes you even get each person on a limb, because even a stray limb can be a problem, especially if you don't know if they have a weapon. Jump on 4 limbs. You ever done that? I've done that before. You got somebody, you don't know what they're doing, there's a group of you guys, you put them down, and then each one of you takes responsibility for a limb. Then you put the hand behind the back, you cuff him, and then usually you can put him on his side. There's generally not a reason to keep somebody prone like that. It's a great position for control, but once they're cuffed, it's like, what are they going to do, you know? You got a bunch of cops standing around you, and you've been cuffed. Cuff his legs, too, but it's like, you can put him on his side. They don't do that. They keep him on his stomach. He's trying to turn to his side, but he can't. I wish he knew some grappling. It might have increased his chances of being able to frame his body in some way to make his breathing more possible. But he couldn't. The cops had no idea what they were doing, and they essentially smothered him to death. kind of almost like the way a python does, where he could breathe, because you only require 100 cubic centimeters of air in your larynx to talk. So you can breathe shallow like this, and you can talk like this. You can talk, but I want to talk like this, and I'm just talking like this. I'm not breathing enough, and I'm going to eventually have to take a breath. You follow? And so you can get air into your larynx and you can talk, but not get air into your lungs. You need 600-700 cubic centimeters of air in your lungs to breathe. You only need 100 cubic centimeters of air in your larynx to talk. And so someone can be choking to death and they can still talk. Does not happen if you're drowning. Because when you're drowning, you're not getting any air into your lungs. You follow? And your body shuts down and stops. Even you want to talk, you can't. Your body won't let you, because talking is a secondary process, not a primary process. And so your body is so busy trying to breathe, it won't let you talk. So you could be sitting right next to somebody, and with your last breath, you can't call out to them. That's why they call it dying by drowning, the silent killer. It's different when you're being asphyxiated and crushed. You can still get some short breaths and you fade out. I thought George Floyd was crying out for his mother with his last breath as he went unconscious, because you usually get into this stage of hypoxic delirium. I've been choked unconscious at least a half a dozen times, and probably closer to a dozen. And sometimes you get into this state of hypoxia where you lose oxygen, and you start to think, you think you're somewhere else. Like you think, I'm on a field, I'm going to lay down for a second, or you just have crazy thoughts, and you don't realize that somebody's got you in some kind of a stranglehold. I've been choked unconscious during sparring sessions while doing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu in a controlled environment. And strangling someone unconscious does not hurt them. Punching somebody in the head, that hurts them. Wrestling, Jiu-Jitsu is the art of control. And then whatever you do from there, joint locks or strangles, whatever it might be. Hitting is just the art of incapacitating, striking someone with your feet or your hands. It's much, much more dangerous. No one ever dies in a grappling tournament. People oftentimes die. Not oftentimes, but every year, 1 or 2 boxers will die. Headgear actually has been proven not to help. It makes the blows more concussive. You cut less, but the blow becomes more concussive, which is actually not a good thing. You'd rather get cut than concussed. Guns are just a lethal option. So it's like grappling controls the person, striking incapacitates the person with blunt force trauma, and firearms kill the person. So that each one of them is an escalating method of combat. Are you guys following me? So they use a non-lethal means. They wrestled him, but they didn't know what they were doing. They had no training. And so they just crushed him to death, because they crushed his diaphragm and the weight of their bodies, and he couldn't take breaths. His lungs and his ribs got kind of caved in, and he asphyxiated like if a python was to constrict you. But it was more in this direction. Like if somebody was to put a heavy enough weight on your back, you would asphyxiate before your back broke, because your lungs wouldn't be able to fill up with air. Your bones would still stay intact, but your lungs wouldn't be able to fill up, because the weight would just be too big over too large an area of your upper body, and you wouldn't be able to get the air in. You can even do that here on somebody's back, but you can definitely do it on somebody's neck. And so that's how he died. A bunch of grown men, 4 men, 800 pounds, sitting on top of him in vulnerable areas, compressing his chest and his neck so he couldn't breathe. Not completely, but so I thought he got this hypoxic delirium, which I've experienced myself, but he didn't. The reason I know that is because he said mama a few times and then started crying out, I can't breathe, And so he was still fully conscious. I had to watch the tape a few times to really be sure of it. But he was crying out for his mother, fully conscious, just at his wit's end. Not in a state of delirium, just in a state of desperation. So that's the story. Did all you guys know that full story? Of course you did. Now you do. Something that we haven't seen that I'm pretty sure is what happened. I watched a friend of mine who's a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu aficionado he's not really a friend of mine, but he's somebody I know in passing, do a report. And when he said this, I was like, oh, that's exactly what happened. You can't see it from the camera angle, but most probably Derek Chauvin with this hand was turking Turk is a wrestling move to control your opponent where you lift their leg up in the air by intertwining it with your legs. He was pulling on his arm so that he could drive his knee. He used the arm as a counterbalance and pulled up on his arm behind the car so you can't see it, so he could drive his knee more into his neck. Do you follow? There's just your weight of 200 pounds on somebody's neck, and if you put your weight on one knee, it's all focused on a very small area as opposed to both knees. So you could just kind of lean over onto one knee and all your weight's on one knee. But then to increase that pressure, almost by several times over, you can start to pull up, which then gives you a bite so you can drive your knee in. There must be a mechanical rule of Newtonian physics that governs this, but some kind of counterbalance, almost like a pulley system or something like that. And so you're pulling up on one thing and it allows you to drive your knee in. You follow? You can't see it, but that's what would have happened. So probably had one hand in his pocket and the other hand was pulling up on his arm. And that, it gets really brutal. And you can fight that kind of stuff off, but it gets tough. A lot of times if you're on top of somebody, you'll stick your knee in their diaphragm and then you'll hold on to their clothes or their lapel if they're wearing a gi, and you'll pull up and you'll drive your knee into them. And it really saps somebody's energy. Because you have to start to keep your stomach tight, and you have to start to breathe while flexing your stomach, and your breaths are much more short, and your stomach has to stay tight. The way boxers' stomachs have to stay tight the whole time they're boxing. But over minutes, your ability to tighten your stomach and breathe, you can't do it, and eventually your abdominal muscles give out. And then that's it. And it's very common, against a novice grappler who doesn't know to turn to his side a little bit and how to breathe with the stomach tensed. You can even tap them out just by applying knee pressure to the diaphragm while pulling up on them. It's kind of a mark of domination in a jiu-jitsu tournament, to be on top of your opponent and put your knee on their diaphragm and pull up on their leg and their lapel and drive your knee into their stomach. It shows mastery of the technique, and also that you've really rendered them helpless. Something like that was going on. Not from the point of view of him being trained, but just he's a little sadistic. I don't think George Chauvin knew he was going to kill, Derek Chauvin knew he was going to kill George Floyd. I just assume he's not that stupid. He was on camera. But he had such a desire to dominate this other individual that it clouded his judgment. He didn't even look down at them for minutes after he was unconscious. And so there's got to be some degree of sadism in there, even if it wasn't murderous intent. There's some degree of sadism in there, of enjoying that kind of power at somebody else's expense. It's disturbing to see that at all. It's really disturbing to see that from someone who's been vested with the power of the government. And it's even more disturbing to see that with somebody who's vested with that power from the government on camera, where they're doing so just with wanton disregard for human life. Anyway, that's the murder of George Floyd. Okay. Give me a little rope here to hang myself. I've got somewhere I'm going with this. Well, USA Today I don't know how much you guys know about crime statistics, but the standard document for mapping crime in the U.S. is the FBI's UCR, their Uniform Crime Report that they publish every year. And the 18,000 police departments in the country are supposed to report to that, but it's voluntary, it's a guideline. And so, generally speaking, about half of the police departments don't report, so the report is sorely lacking. I'll explain it to you. Huh? You're nodding your head. Yes, I'm saying I don't think you do, but I'm going to explain it to you. So everybody else is saying no. You were saying yes, so you're the one I'm doubting. There's something called castle law. Castle law is that if you're in your home or your place of business, you do not have to retreat. If someone comes into your home or your place of business, you don't have to retreat. You're allowed. Anywhere you are is your castle, and no one can make you move an inch. And if anybody encroaches on your space, you can draw a line in the sand and say, don't cross that line. If they do cross that line, they've invaded your castle, and you're allowed to defend yourself with any means necessary, provided you can explain that you had a reason to fear for your life. You can't say he walked past me and I was afraid for my life. They take into account what a reasonable person would feel. So George Zimmerman got off on the stand your ground law. He was allowed to carry a firearm in Florida. I don't even know if he had to carry a concealed weapons permit. And he was allowed to shoot Trayvon Martin because he had a reasonable fear for his life, even though he'd approached Trayvon Martin, even though he picked the fight, even though he could have left, he got what he got off on. We don't have stand your ground laws in California. You're under a legal obligation to try and leave the situation. Did you learn something?
No.
I'm sorry?
I knew that. I remember the story, so I knew that.
You knew all of this, castle law, the whole thing?
I didn't know the castle law, but I knew the definition of stand.
Okay, all right, yeah, okay. So I did contribute something to your knowledge base.
Yeah, let's try to call me out.
I apologize, Ian. It's nice to have your association. That started the Black Lives Matter movement. And what happened was, they started using the Freedom of Information Act to approach police departments all over the country and do meticulous journalistic work and compile the most comprehensive databases of crime in this country that have ever been compiled. So now the databases it's not possible to research everything. It could be double that amount, but at least we know 34. 132 deaths are listed as asphyxiation during arrest. $132 cases. So that's like 13 and a half per year. Cops strangle to death or people asphyxiate while being arrested. Usually in a prone position with their hands cuffed behind their back and officers sitting on top of them. That they might not have said, "I can't breathe," but that happens. That gets reported about 15 times a year for the last 10 years around the country. A lot of times the medical reports will cite something called excited delirium. People are kind of freaking out so bad they asphyxiate themselves, but there are no cases of excited delirium in existence other than when cops are arresting you and have you face down prone with your hands tied behind your back. So excited delirium in that case would be almost like a euphemism for police officers strangling you to death or crushing you to death. Really, strangling isn't correct because a strangle implies some kind of like you're actually like purposefully doing this as opposed to like a blunt crush just from a dog pile. And so they cite excited delirium, and almost none of these cops get prosecuted. But this happens in this country. Maybe not as frequently as one would think, but it does happen. 15 times a year, 13 times a year. And nobody's really doing anything about it. Now, a lot of people are saying like defund the police, which in an absolutist sense of getting rid of the police is just preposterous. It's idiotic in the sense of, like in the actual sense of the term. Extremely low IQ. To interpret defunding the police in an absolute sense. Because it would be like the purge. I've lived through riots when the cops bailed. It's I've also been in places where there are no cops. I've been in riots where there are no police, like in rural India. It is terrifying. It's insanity. It brings out the absolute worst in people. So anyway, when people talk about defunding the police, what they really mean is let's get more social workers out there. Let's get community leaders out there. Let's get mental health professionals out there. Defense budget is so big. Sometimes you look at graphs and you'll see the police budget is like, they got a graph and the police budget is like here and everything else is like here. Education, all these ones, like this big, and the police one's like this big. 5 million, 10 million, 400 million. Crazy disparity. So let's just focus on the cops coming out when you need somebody with a deadly weapon, when you need deadly force. And let's stop having the police civilization is based on violence. The law of the jungle is based on violence. Social mammals follow a culture of violence. In social mammals, you have the alpha. The alpha is the most physically dominant male in the pack. That's how it works. The alpha's position oftentimes gets challenged. The alpha has to defeat the challenger. Amongst wolves, which in many ways mirror human society, when the alpha defeats the challenger, the last thing the challenger does is roll over and do this with on its back. Rolls over and goes like this and puts his head up, allowing the alpha to grab a hold of his throat and rip his throat out. But then the alpha doesn't do that. That's the symbol of I give up. That's like tapping out. It's understood you're giving up and you're making yourself vulnerable. The most vulnerable part of your body, your neck is the most vulnerable part of your body. Everything. Your carotid arteries, so many vital organs, your spine. And they've just passed through this little bottleneck. And it's totally indefensible. It's like the most vulnerable part of the body. Anyway, we'll get back to that in a minute too. But when you get to human beings and we form civilizations, the undercurrent of every civilization that has ever existed and will ever exist is the threat of violence. When you look at a document like the U.S. Constitution that preserves the right to life and liberty and pursuit of happiness, the two ones are absolute. You have a right to life and freedom. Your pursuit of happiness is a third right. It's listed third on purpose because your pursuit of happiness cannot obfuscate or inflict upon the civilization. civilization depends on there being consequences for breaking of social norms. And what that boils down to is, if you commit rape or murder or you harm somebody, then we have a gang of large people who are armed better than you are, who will come and capture you. You follow? If traffic laws became traffic guidelines, no one would follow them. When a police officer pulls you over, he's following city ordinance, which follows state law, which follows federal law, which follows the Constitution. And the cop who pulls you over is actually carrying the authority of God. He pulls you over. If you don't pull over, he uses increasing force to make you pull over until eventually they kill you. They ram your car off the road and shoot you to death if you still won't get out of your car. That is the cornerstone of civilization. It's violence. It's intentional, well thought out, carefully constructed violence designed to protect the weak and the innocent from harm. Our Creator domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and ensure the blessings of liberty for ourselves and our posterity. To ordain and establish this Constitution of the United States of America. That's how it begins. That's the preamble. We establish justice. He's representing the city ordinance, the state law, the federal law, the Constitution, and ultimately God adjudicating justice and coming up with a fair system. You follow this? This is any legal system in the world. Krishna says in the Gita, Danda damayatam aham. Damayatam, of means of controlling people. No? I just told you the danda. Everyone in the room knows danda. According to old Indian legal manuals, there's 4 ways of dealing with difficult situations. Sama, you ignore it. A lot of times they'll just go away. That works sometimes. Sometimes the best thing to do is just let them go away. Oftentimes there'll be some person, they'll yell at me or make some trouble, and I'll just ignore them because that's the best thing to do. They'll go away. You ignore them and they go away. You give them the silent treatment and eventually they tire out and go away. This happened to my daughter today. She was crying and making noise and I ignored her and she stopped crying and then we got back to life. My 2-year-old. You become an agent provocateur and you figure out a way in and you disrupt things. You divide and conquer. You find the weak point in your enemy and you use that to disrupt their unity. A classic thing that goes back the deity in this world. We're endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, and the police are ultimately protecting those rights. And when they betray you, it's the worst betrayal, and they wield the most power, and they have the most impunity. They have the most immunity. They have qualified immunity. When a cop is acting as a cop, they can't be prosecuted. Like someone with diplomatic immunity, they have a qualified immunity and step outside of policing and do something which is wrong and outside of the scope of their employment, and then they can be tried, which is what's going to happen to Derek Chauvin and his accomplices. They broke the rule, they broke the covenant. They failed the system they were sworn to protect, they abused it. There were cops who raped women that they pulled over on traffic stops. This happens every few years. You hear about this. Some police officer is raping women that he pulls over on traffic stops. And it's like, and they get the book thrown at them because that kind of a betrayal where they use the power vested in them, a sacred thing, and they betray that trust. It's the most morally repugnant thing. It's why child molestation is so universally taboo. Because someone with all the power uses it to take advantage of someone with no power. It's the most disturbing thing. It creates the most anger and disgust in society, and the swiftest and most strong retribution. I think we need a stronger police force. I think all of our police officers should have to be extremely fit, be able to run. They also have to be really strong. They have to be masters of hand-to-hand combat. They have to be better wrestlers. They have to know how to apply proper chokeholds to control larger and difficult to control opponents, because those are non-lethal ways of dealing with things. Otherwise, you end up with them pulling out their guns, and once they pull out their gun, there's only one way to escalate. If somebody calls your bluff, you have to shoot them. But if you have a bunch of non-lethal things, you can go through your deck, and you can play card after card. You can start by wrestling, then you can strike them, and then you can deploy a firearm. And you can move from non-lethal to lethal ways of controlling somebody. And when you look at these police officers and the way they mercilessly crushed the life out of George Floyd, sadistically, you see they were not trained in the art of wrestling and grappling, which is why they did not know what they were doing. If they had that knowledge, it would have taken less of them to control George Floyd. They would have known the danger of the techniques they were engaging in, and they would have been able to pull back before they went so far there was no going back. Krishna says he's the stick. I think the stick is necessary. Our Constitution thinks it. All civilizations think it. You think it too if you think about it carefully enough. What we need is more qualified police officers who can handle the responsibility that's been given to them, and they have to have more tools in their toolbox, and they have to know how to use those tools so non-lethal weapons don't become lethal weapons, and they don't just lazily dogpile someone to death because they're too weak and incompetent to do anything else. When you see a really strong, in shape, powerful, expert police officer who's trained how to fight, they don't have to pull out their guns so often. They can speak softly because they carry many big sticks that they can use. So, I want to give you guys a commentary on the specifics of George Floyd's death. I want to also talk to you guys a little bit about our legal system and the ultimately philosophical substratum of any legal system. How much time we got?
20 seconds.
And I wanted to look at what our ancient texts say and how they actually have the same